the white blanket. Maternal instinct or staging element. We've descended into the wine cellar and traced the geography of isolation. We've examined flashlights that bore no prints and pineapple that rewrote timelines. And now we need to pause at something so tender, so laden with the weight of love and loss, that it sits almost unbearable in the crime scene photographs. We need to think about the white blanket, not just any blanket, but the one wrapped around her small body in that cold basement room, tucked carefully as if sleep, rather than finality, had claimed her. Because here's what refuses to sit quietly in the staging we've been examining. This gesture, this wrapping, this covering, carries a quality that transcends the cold calculation we've seen in other staging elements. It whispers of something more complicated, more fractured, more human than the careful evidence management and timeline construction we've traced through these chapters. The blanket asks us to hold two truths simultaneously: that someone staged elements of that scene for investigative misdirection, and that someone also responded with the ancient maternal impulse to cover a child, to provide comfort even when comfort has ceased to have meaning, to perform the gestures of care even in the presence of what can no longer be cared for. Let's establish what we understand about the blanket before we begin to unravel what its presence means. From a forensic perspective, the blanket wasn't hers. It came from elsewhere in the house, was brought to the wine cellar, and wrapped around her with what investigators described as almost tender precision. The wrapping wasn't haphazard, wasn't the careless covering that might emerge from pure concealment motive. It was careful, deliberate, creating an image that many who saw the photographs described as peaceful, as if she were merely sleeping rather than lost. And this quality, this carefulness, this attention to creating an appearance of sleep and comfort, tells us something about the consciousness of the person who did the wrapping. It tells us about love existing alongside staging, about maternal impulse operating even in circumstances where staging was also clearly occurring, about the terrible complexity of human psychology when the unbearable must be faced and somehow managed. Theme 1. The architecture of care, when love and staging cannot be separated. When we think about the act of wrapping a child in a blanket, we're thinking about one of the most primal, caregiving gestures that exists in human behavior. From an anthropological perspective, covering children to provide warmth and comfort appears across all cultures, across all of human history. Mothers wrap their babies, tuck their children into bed, ensure they're covered and warm. These gestures are so deeply encoded in caregiving behavior that they operate almost unconsciously, triggered automatically by the sight of a vulnerable child. And this is what makes the blanket so psychologically complex as evidence. The person who wrapped her might have been staging, creating an image meant to suggest certain interpretations to investigators who would eventually enter that space. But they were also, simultaneously, expressing something that transcends staging, something that emerges from the deepest layers of maternal psychology, even in circumstances where nothing can truly comfort anymore. Let's think about what it means to wrap someone carefully, when careful wrapping serves no practical purpose. From a logical perspective, if the goal was pure concealment, the blanket wasn't necessary. Her location in the remote wine cellar already provided concealment. If the goal was staging, the blanket contributed to creating a particular image, but so would many other possible elements. What the blanket uniquely provided was comfort, not for her because she was beyond comfort, but for the person doing the wrapping. From a psychological standpoint, when we face unbearable reality, we often continue performing the familiar gestures of care because those gestures provide us psychological refuge from what we cannot bear to fully confront. The act of wrapping, of tucking, of ensuring she was covered, these might have allowed the wrapper to maintain, if only for moments, the fiction that they were simply putting a child to bed, that the ancient rituals of caregiving still held meaning, that love could still find expression even in the presence of irreversible loss. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, can staging and genuine emotion coexist in the same act? Can the same gesture serve both instrumental purposes, creating images meant to mislead investigation, and express authentic feeling, the need to provide care even when care has ceased to have practical meaning? The blanket suggests, yes, that human consciousness in extremity operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The wrapper might have understood consciously that the blanket contributed to staging, that it created a particular visual impression that would shape interpretation. But that same person might also have been responding to impulses so deep, so fundamental to their identity as a caregiver, that wrapping the child wasn't a choice, but a compulsion, an action they couldn't not perform, regardless of what strategic purposes it might also serve. This multiplicity of motivation, this coexistence of calculation and care, reflects the fractured consciousness that extreme trauma creates. Now let's consider what the specific way the blanket was wrapped tells us about the wrapper's state of mind. From a forensic perspective, investigators noted the care in the wrapping, the precision, the attention to ensuring she was fully covered, the quality that suggested someone taking time to do this properly rather than hurriedly. And this care tells us something important. The wrapper wasn't operating in panic or chaos in that moment. They had regained enough psychological equilibrium, enough control over their actions to perform the wrapping with attention and precision. From a physiological standpoint, this suggests that by the time the wrapping occurred, the acute crisis phase had passed. The wrapper had moved from whatever initial reaction followed the terrible events to a state where deliberate action was possible, where hands could be steady, where attention could be focused on the task of arranging elements, including this final gesture of coverage and care. Let's shift to thinking about maternal instinct specifically and what it demands, even in impossible circumstances. From a psychological perspective, maternal caregiving behaviors are among the most resistant to extinction. They persist even when circumstances render them functionally meaningless. A mother whose child has passed will still smooth their hair, still adjust their clothing, still perform the small gestures of care that defined her relationship to that child throughout their life together. These actions serve no practical purpose, but they serve profound psychological purpose. They allow the mother to maintain, even briefly, her identity as caregiver, to express love through the only means still available, to resist the terrible truth that her role has ended by continuing to perform its rituals. The blanket wrapping might represent exactly this kind of persistent caregiving behavior. emerging not from strategic staging considerations, but from the deep psychological need to continue caring, even when caring can change nothing. From an anthropological lens, we can examine how different cultures handle the bodies of lost children and what those handling rituals reveal about love and grief. Across cultures, there's remarkable consistency in the impulse to treat the body with tenderness, to cover and protect even when protection is no longer needed, to perform the gestures that love requires. The blanket wrapping aligns with this universal pattern. It's what loving caregivers do, what mothers do, what people do when faced with the unbearable reality of a child who has been lost. Whether that impulse was operating in its pure form or was complicated by awareness of staging needs, the fundamental gesture remains recognizable. Someone who loved her, someone whose identity was bound up in caring for her, performed one final act of coverage, of protection, of the comfort that caregiving had always provided throughout her short life. From a criminological standpoint, when we see staging elements that carry emotional weight, that seem to express genuine feeling alongside instrumental purpose, we're looking at complex psychology rather than cold calculation. Someone who could spend hours crafting a ransom note with careful characterization might be operating from different psychological states at different moments, focused and strategic during the note writing, but overwhelmed by maternal impulse during the blanket wrapping. Or the same act might serve both purposes simultaneously, calculation and care operating in parallel rather than in sequence. Understanding which interpretation fits requires looking at the totality of evidence, at whether the person we're examining had capacity for this kind of psychological complexity, for holding multiple layers of motivation and action in the fractured consciousness that trauma creates. So, when we step back and consider the architecture of care, how the blanket was wrapped, what that wrapping reveals about coexisting motivations, whether staging and authentic caregiving can inhabit the same gesture, we're looking at evidence that refuses simple categorization. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the blanket represents something more complicated than pure staging or pure emotional response. It represents both existing in the impossible space where love and desperation intersect, where the impulse to protect and comfort persists despite unbearable circumstances, where a mother might simultaneously be staging a scene for investigators and expressing the only form of care still available to her. The blanket becomes testament not just to what was staged, but to what endured. Maternal instinct operating even in extremity, caregiving gestures persisting even when their object could no longer benefit from care. Love finding its expression through covering and tucking and ensuring that even in loss, even in the cold isolation of that wine cellar, a child would not be left uncovered, exposed, alone in the darkness that had claimed her. Theme 2, the duality of purpose, how single acts serve multiple needs. We've established that the blanket might express both staging and genuine care, and now we need to think more deeply about how this duality operates psychologically. Because understanding the blanket requires understanding something fundamental about human consciousness in crisis. We don't operate from single motivations, single purposes, single clear intentions. From a psychological perspective, extreme stress fractures consciousness, creates states where multiple parallel processes operate simultaneously, where we can be doing one thing for multiple reasons without clearly distinguishing which reason is primary. The blanket wrapping might be exactly this kind of multiply-motivated action, serving staging needs while also serving psychological needs, creating images for external viewers while also creating comfort for the person performing the action, functioning instrumentally while also functioning expressively in ways the actor might not fully recognize or acknowledge even to themselves. Let's think about what this tells us about guilt and how guilt operates in consciousness. From a philosophical perspective, if someone was involved in staging, if they spent hours that night creating alternative narratives about what occurred, they would be carrying tremendous psychological burden. Not just the grief of loss, but the guilt of concealment, the terrible knowledge that they were actively working to hide truth rather than reveal it. And in that state, in that crushing weight of what they were doing, the blanket wrapping might have provided psychological relief. It allowed them, for the duration of that action, to be a caregiver again rather than a concealer. It let them express love rather than guilt, let them do something that felt pure and right, even as so much else they were doing felt corrupted by necessity. The blanket becomes, in this reading, a moment of psychological refuge within the larger context of staging, a gesture that let the person briefly inhabit their pre-crisis identity as loving caregiver, rather than their current impossible role as manager of unbearable circumstances. From an anthropological lens, we need to understand that staging often incorporates elements that seem unnecessary from pure instrumental perspective, but serve deep psychological needs for the stager. When people create false narratives around terrible events, they don't just think about what will convince investigators, they also think about what will allow them to live with themselves, what narrative framework will make ongoing existence possible, despite what they know and what they've done. The blanket might serve this function by wrapping her carefully, by ensuring she looked peaceful and cared for. The wrapper created an image that could coexist with their self-concept as loving parent. They could tell themselves, even in the midst of staging, that they were still caring for her, still being the parent they had always been, still performing the gestures of love that defined their relationship, regardless of what else they were also doing to manage investigation and conceal truth. Now, let's consider what forensic psychologists understand about behavior in the immediate aftermath of terrible loss. From a criminological perspective, there's a phenomenon documented in cases where family members are involved in staging. They often incorporate elements of genuine grief and care into the staging itself, not because these elements serve instrumental purpose. Often they complicate rather than aid the staging, but because the person cannot help themselves. The loss is real, the grief is real, the love was real, and these realities leak through into the staging, creating patterns that feel emotionally genuine even within contexts of evident manipulation. The blanket might be exactly such leakage, an element that wasn't necessary for staging, that might even have created problems by introducing fiber evidence or other forensic complications, but that the person simply could not refrain from including because their psychological needs demanded it. Let's shift to thinking about how external viewers interpret such elements when they encounter them. From a psychological standpoint, When investigators see tender care gestures in scenes that also show evidence of staging, they face interpretive challenges. Does the tenderness suggest the person couldn't be responsible for what occurred? That genuine love and caregiving are incompatible with involvement in terrible events? Or does the tenderness simply reflect the complexity of human psychology? The reality that people who love children can still be involved in circumstances that lead to loss, and that their love doesn't disappear even when terrible things have happened. The blanket forces this question. Can we hold simultaneously the recognition that it represents genuine maternal care and the recognition that it exists within a staged scene? And if we can hold both truths, what does that teach us about the person who did the wrapping? From a philosophical perspective, we're confronting questions about the relationship between action and intention, between what we do and why we do it. The phenomenology of wrapping that blanket, the physical actions, the attention required, the time invested, would have been the same whether the motivation was pure staging or pure caregiving or some complex mixture. The wrapper's hands tucked the fabric, ensured coverage, arranged the folds. But what was happening psychologically during those actions? Was there conscious awareness of serving multiple purposes? Or was the wrapper simply responding to impulse, letting their hands do what hands that have cared for a child know how to do, while the reasoning behind those actions remained murky even to themselves? Human consciousness often operates this way. We act, and only later, if ever, do we understand why we acted, what needs we were serving, what purposes our actions fulfilled beyond our conscious intentions. From a criminological standpoint, understanding the blanket's dual purpose matters for understanding the psychology of whoever wrapped it. If we can recognize that a single act might serve both staging and authentic emotional needs, we can better understand the state of mind that created the complex scene in that wine cellar. Not cold calculation, but fractured consciousness. Not pure manipulation, but terrible necessity coexisting with genuine love. Not either or, but both. And someone operating in the impossible space where staging for investigation meets caring for a lost child, where the practical requirements of managing what would be discovered meet the psychological requirements of remaining a loving parent, even in circumstances that tested the limits of what love could encompass. The blanket becomes evidence of this complexity, this refusal of human psychology to be simple even when we wish it were, this persistence of care even in contexts of evident concealment. So when we consider the duality of purpose, how the blanket served multiple needs simultaneously, what that multiplicity reveals about fractured consciousness, whether we can hold both instrumental and expressive motivations as equally real, we're seeing something fundamental about human psychology in extremity. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the blanket refuses to be only one thing. It's staging, yes, contributing to creating a particular visual impression, a particular interpretation of what occurred in that space. But it's also love, also maternal instinct, operating beyond the reach of conscious control, also the gesture of a person who couldn't stop being a caregiver even when caregiving had lost its practical meaning. And this duality, this coexistence of calculation and care, tells us something crucial about who wrapped that blanket and what state they were in when they did it. Not someone operating from pure criminal intent, but someone operating from the impossible complexity of circumstances that required staging while not eliminating love, that demanded concealment while not erasing maternal impulse, that created terrible necessity for management while leaving intact the fundamental identity as parent, that no crisis, no matter how unbearable, could entirely destroy. Theme 3. The weight of witness, what the blanket tells us about who was there. We've examined how the blanket serves dual purposes and what that duality reveals about consciousness. And now we need to confront what the blanket's presence tells us about identity, about who could have wrapped it, who would have wrapped it, what the act of wrapping reveals about the person performing it. Because not everyone would respond this way. Not everyone would incorporate this particular gesture into staging. From a forensic perspective, the blanket represents a behavioral signature, a pattern of action that tells us something about the actor independent of their stated identity. And when we examine what the blanket reveals, when we ask who wraps children in blankets with tender precision, even in impossible circumstances, we find ourselves looking not at abstract possibilities, but at specific psychological profiles, specific relationships, specific identities that make certain actions more likely than others. Let's think about who wraps children and what wrapping represents in family structures. From an anthropological perspective, blanket wrapping is predominantly maternal behavior. Mothers put children to bed. Mothers tuck blankets. Mothers ensure their children are covered and comfortable. Not exclusively. Fathers can certainly perform these caregiving actions. But the pattern, the frequency, the automaticity with which this particular gesture emerges under stress, these are more commonly associated with maternal caregiving than with other family roles. So when we see careful blanket wrapping in a staged scene, when we see attention to ensuring coverage and creating appearance of peaceful sleep, we're seeing behavior that statistically, psychologically, anthropologically aligns more strongly with maternal identity than with other possible identities of people who might have been in that wine cellar during those hours. From a psychological standpoint, let's consider what the precision of the wrapping tells us about the wrapper's state. We've noted that investigators describe the wrapping as careful, deliberate, creating impression of sleep rather than careless covering. This level of care requires sustained attention, requires the wrapper to be focused on the task rather than operating in pure panic. And this tells us something about where the blanket wrapping fell in the sequence of events that night. If it occurred immediately after whatever terrible thing happened, we might expect more haste, more distress evident in how the covering was done. But if it occurred later, after some time had passed for initial shock to recede, after the person had moved into the terrible work of managing what would be discovered, then the precision makes more sense. The wrapper had regained enough composure to perform the action with care, with attention to detail, with the kind of deliberateness that creates the powerful image that photographs later preserved. Now, let's think about what it means that this particular element, the blanket, is one of the few staging components that feels emotionally genuine rather than calculated. From a criminological perspective, when we examine the staging in that wine cellar, we see elements that clearly served instrumental purposes, positioning meant to suggest certain narratives, items placed to create particular impressions. But the blanket stands somewhat apart from these other elements. It doesn't obviously serve narrative construction in the way other staging components do. What it serves is something more subtle, more psychological. It allows the scene to coexist with the wrapper's self-concept as loving caregiver. It creates visual consonance with identity, even in circumstances that threatened to shatter that identity. And this tells us the wrapper cared deeply about maintaining that identity, needed to see themselves and be seen as loving parent, even in the midst of doing things that served very different purposes. Let's shift to considering what maternal guilt looks like and how it expresses itself in action. From a psychological perspective, mothers whose children are lost often experience overwhelming guilt regardless of their level of responsibility. If they were truly uninvolved, they feel guilt for not protecting their child. If they were involved in any way, that guilt becomes nearly unbearable. And guilt of this magnitude seeks expression, seeks ways to perform penance, to demonstrate continuing love, to prove to themselves and others that they remain good mothers despite what has occurred. The blanket wrapping might serve exactly this guilt-driven expressive need, allowing the mother to demonstrate tender care, to show, even if only to herself in that moment, that she was still being a good mother, still caring for her child in the only way remaining available. The gesture becomes a kind of prayer, an offering to identity and love that circumstances have rendered nearly meaningless, but that psychological need demands anyway. From an anthropological lens, we can examine how different cultures ritualize the handling of those who have been lost and what those rituals reveal about relationship and role. Across cultures, the person who performs the final caretaking, washing, dressing, arranging, is typically the person whose role in life was primary caregiver. Mothers prepare their children, wives prepare their husbands. The rituals of final care fall to those whose identity was most bound up in caring for the person who has passed. The blanket wrapping aligns with this pattern. It's a final caregiving act performed by someone whose identity as a caregiver was so fundamental that they continued performing its gestures even when those gestures could no longer serve their original purpose. This tells us something about the relationship between wrapper and child, suggests bonds so deep that care persisted beyond the point where care could meaningfully help. From a philosophical perspective, we need to ask, what does the blanket tell us about love and its relationship to truth? If someone loved a child deeply, genuinely, with the full intensity that parental love can achieve, does that love make them more or less likely to engage in staging if circumstances demand it? The comfortable answer is that true love would preclude staging, that someone who genuinely loved a child would simply tell truth regardless of consequences. But human psychology is more complex. Someone who loves deeply might be precisely the person most likely to stage if they believe staging serves protective purposes, if telling truth would harm another child they also love, if their family's survival depends on creating alternative narrative, if the terrible calculation has been made that truth destroys everything while staging might save something. The blanket exists in this complex space where deep love and desperate concealment intersect, where genuine maternal care and calculated staging occupy the same gesture, where the person wrapping was simultaneously expressing authentic feeling and managing what would be discovered. So when we consider the weight of witness, what the blanket tells us about who was there, what identity patterns make the wrapping more comprehensible, what the careful precision reveals about relationship and role, we see evidence pointing toward specific identity rather than abstract possibility. From every analytical perspective, logical, philosophical, psychological, physiological, forensic, anthropological, and criminological, the blanket represents maternal caregiving behavior, expresses the particular psychology of someone whose identity was fundamentally bound to caring for this child, reveals patterns of action more consistent with mother than with other possible family roles. This doesn't constitute proof in legal sense. Behavior patterns suggest likelihood, but don't eliminate other possibilities. But it creates a framework for understanding who most probably performed this particular action in this particular way, who would naturally, automatically respond to the sight of an uncovered child with the impulse to cover her, who would invest the time and attention to ensure the covering was done carefully enough to create the powerful impression that photographs preserved. Someone wrapped that blanket. Someone tucked it with precision and care. Someone stood in that cold wine cellar and performed this final act of maternal love despite unbearable circumstances. And that someone, based on everything we understand about caregiving behavior and identity, and the persistence of maternal impulse, even in extremity, was most likely the person whose entire identity had been built around caring for this child. The mother who couldn't stop being mother, even when being mother meant performing its rituals in the presence of loss that no caregiving could address, no tucking could comfort, no coverage could protect from the terrible finality that had already claimed her daughter, despite every impulse to keep her warm, safe, and covered against whatever darkness waited beyond the reach of even the deepest love. We've walked through care and calculation, through dual purposes and fractured consciousness, through behavioral signatures that point toward specific identity. What emerges isn't simple accusation, but complex understanding. Recognition that the blanket represents something more nuanced than either pure staging or pure emotion. It represents both, coexisting in the impossible psychological space that extreme trauma creates. Someone wrapped that blanket. Someone tucked it carefully. Someone performed this final gesture of maternal care in circumstances where care had ceased to have practical meaning, but where the impulse to care persisted beyond reason, beyond calculation, beyond the conscious control that might have recognized such gesture as complicating the staging being constructed. The blanket becomes testimony to love that endured even in extremity, to maternal instinct operating below conscious direction, to the terrible truth that people can love deeply while also doing desperate things to manage what that love could not prevent. It sits in those photographs as the most human element of a scene that shows clear evidence of construction, the one gesture that refuses to be only instrumental, that carries emotional weight too genuine to be merely performed. And in that authenticity, in that refusal to be simply one thing or another, the blanket whispers truths about fractured consciousness, about love and guilt coexisting, about maternal identity persisting, even when circumstances demanded other identities, other actions, other terrible necessities that required hours in that cold wine cellar, doing what mothers should never have to do, wrapping their children in white blankets, not for sleep, but for discovery, performing the gestures of care for the final time, creating images of peace when peace had been shattered beyond any staging's power to restore, beyond any blanket's ability to provide the comfort and protection that maternal love had always, until that terrible night, been able to give.